A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Glad to have you with us today. Boy, it is heating up there on Capitol Hill. We've got a lot to get to, including an armed citizen story for you. We've also got a good deed. More news from the failing criminal justice system, but let's get to some headlines to start things off, shall we? President Donald Trump speaking with anti-gun members of Congress, reaching out to Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy to talk about gun control, specifically to talk about background checks. And we've also seen reported over the last 18 or so hours that the president's children are weighing in on opposite sides of the gun control debate. Ivanka Trump speaking out publicly about the need for more background checks, while Donald Trump Jr., according to a Business Insider, quietly advising his dad, the president, that, listen, you keep pushing these red flag bills, you keep pushing for universal background checks, and that's really going to be unpopular among your base. Is he right? Yeah, I think so, actually. There's a new Morning Consult poll out showing that support among Republicans for new gun control measures has dropped. It is now below 50%. I believe 47% say in this new Morning Consult poll that, they support more gun control laws. 45% say no, they don't. So basically a statistical tie and a decline of about 6 points since the question was asked in March of last year, shortly after the murders in Parkland, Florida. And it's interesting, too, because we've talked about some of the shenanigans that go on with these polls. There was a poll out in Ohio recently, and it asked about background checks. Do you support background checks on all sales of firearms? And something like 90% approve of background checks on all gun sales. But then you ask the question, do you think that Ohio should have stricter gun laws? And support is not 90%. It's, I think, at like 48%. So what's going on here? Again, I think a lot of Americans, when they hear, do you support background checks for gun sales, they're thinking of the existing system. They're thinking of what we already have, which does require background checks for every retail sale or commercial sale of a firearm. Start talking about private sales, and people who aren't gun owners, they don't think about this stuff a lot. They don't have to think about this stuff a lot. So I don't get angry. I've seen some folks online who are like, oh, you're just a dummy. No, they're not. They don't think about these issues. Why would they? I don't spend my days thinking about, nuclear science. I don't have to. So what I like to do is I like to, just kind of help people understand what it is that we're talking about. When we're talking about quote unquote universal background checks, why they're unenforceable, unless you try to couple them with a firearms registration system. And even then, that opens up a whole other can of worms. So the next time, you're talking to somebody who's a non-gun owner and they say, well, why shouldn't you have to go through a background check? Ask them, how's the government going to know? How's the government going to know if you want to buy a gun from me and I say, okay, I'll sell you a gun? How's the government going to be aware of that in order to police that sale? We've talked before with Sheriff Tony Mace in Cibola County, New Mexico, about that state's quote-unquote universal background check law. It is the most recent of the background check laws to come on the books. And it still amazes me that so much political capital was spent pushing that bill for what it actually is. It's a misdemeanor offense in the state of New Mexico to transfer a firearm. Well, again, there are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, it's a misdemeanor offense to transfer that firearm without going to a federally licensed firearms dealer, having them conduct the background check. If it's a temporary transfer, you got to go through the whole process again at the end of that temporary transfer. And in New Mexico, in order for law enforcement to make arrests for misdemeanor crimes, they actually have to witness the crime taking place. Or they basically have to have a confession from an individual that, I committed this crime. That's the only way that anybody could possibly be arrested, much less charged with an offense like this. And yet you had so many politicians in the state of New Mexico calling this desperately needed. Oh, we've got to have this legislation. Oh, this is just common sense. No, it's not. It's nonsensical. It's absolutely nonsensical. And again, that's New Mexico. But any federal, quote unquote, universal background check legislation would not be a misdemeanor offense. It would be a federal felony, punishable by up to a year in prison if you are found to have transferred a firearm without going through an FFL. And again, you didn't meet one of these narrow circumstances where there would be an exemption here. But you still have that issue of, well, how are we going to know, right? So the only way that this law could possibly be enforced would not be proactively. It would be retroactively. It would be after a firearm has been recovered, most likely a firearm that was used in a crime. You're able to, if you're able to figure out, okay, well, here's where the gun was sold at retail, and then somehow it ended up in the hands of that person over there. We'll go talk to the person who bought it at retail, find out what they have to say. If you get lucky and they say, oh, yeah, I sold that guy a gun. I probably should have gone through background check, but I didn't do it. Then maybe you can charge somebody. But what happens if that individual says, yeah, I bought that gun 5 years ago, and 3 years ago it got reported stolen. Or 5 years ago I bought that gun, 3 years ago I sold that gun. And there was no background check law on the books then. So I didn't violate the law. What are you going to do if you're a prosecutor? Probably not much of anything, right? So again, there are real issues here. As a gun owner and as a Second Amendment supporter, every time we have one of these gun control moments where you see, politicians out there, beating their podium and calling for these quote unquote common sense gun safety reform measures that are really just the same tired gun control laws that they've been trying to push for decades. I have to push back against those ineffective, unconstitutional, and in many cases unenforceable gun control laws. But, there's a part of me that gets really disappointed. I should be way more cynical than this. But, think about what prompted this latest push for these same gun control laws, right? The attack in El Paso, Texas, that left 22 people dead. The attack in Dayton, Ohio, that left 9 people dead. And, people on the left will say, well, we can't keep having this same tired debate. Well, you're part of this problem too, in having the same tired debate, because you keep calling to do something as opposed to doing something that works. Lawmakers, again, they make laws. When they're hearing do something, that's their first response. I better make a law. So it is frustrating that, again, we do keep going in this circle and in this merry-go-round. But part of why we keep doing that is that the gun control proposals that we hear are so ineffectual, so unenforceable, and again, in many cases, so unconstitutional that, yes, you're going to get objections to them. And sadly, part of this merry-go-round is that the objections that are raised never get addressed, right? In fact, you are a cold, uncaring gun humper for even bringing up these objections, for even bringing up these concerns, as opposed to not just going along. All right, so September 9th, that is when the U.S. Senate gets back in session. You've got lawmakers calling Mitch McConnell a coward for not bringing the Senate back into session before then, but I don't really think that that's going to change Cocaine Mitch's mind here. But there is something that is worth keeping an eye on if you're an American gun owner. We've got a lot of stuff within our own borders to keep an eye on, but up in Canada, they're getting ready for their federal elections in October. And Justin Trudeau was meeting yesterday with the mayor of Toronto and was asked about, the mayor of Toronto, by the way, wants a handgun ban nationwide. The way Canadian law works, you can't have a local handgun ban. You would need to have a federal ban on handguns. And this was actually brought up by Justin Trudeau last year. He directed the public safety minister, Bill Blair, to go out and sort of do a listening tour, talk to stakeholders around the country, and figure out, okay, can we ban handguns? Can we ban semi-automatic firearms? And Bill Blair did this. He was supposed to have his report done, I think, by the end of December last year. Got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back until the spring of this year. He came out. And Bill Blair has not come out and said, yep, we need a handgun ban and a semi-auto ban. He's kind of walked back the idea of a handgun ban. He said, we definitely need to ban these quote-unquote assault weapons, however. So you've got sort of a split now in Canada. Again, the hard left is out there calling for a ban on handguns and semi-automatic long guns. Meanwhile, the quote-unquote moderate left is just calling for a ban on quote-unquote assault weapons. So Justin Trudeau meets with the mayor of Toronto yesterday and will not commit to a handgun ban. But he does say that more gun control is coming, that voters in Canada are going to have to wait until early September when the Liberal Party campaign platform is released to know exactly what Justin Trudeau is calling for. And it struck me as I was writing the story last night for Bearing Arms that document could very well be coming out around the same time that the U.S. Senate is getting back in session. And it is not inconceivable to me that gun control activists here in the United States, gun control activists in Canada, anti-gun politicians in the United States, and anti-gun politicians in Canada might try to use the timing of those two events to actually push for a quote-unquote assault weapons ban here in the United States. So imagine this scenario. It's September 8th. And Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Party, weeks before their federal elections in Canada, released their campaign plank on gun control, and they announced, we are going to be banning all semi-automatic long guns. It is time that we take this step. It's time to be bold. It's time to lead. And we're going to ensure that these modern battlefield weapons of war cannot be sold on the streets of Canada anymore. What would that do to the news cycle here in the United States as the U.S. Senate then meets the following day to debate a number of gun control proposals? Remember, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has already said, he expects that a quote-unquote assault weapons ban would be front and center. Doesn't think it's got the votes to pass, but he said, it's probably going to be one of those things that we debate. The media here in the United States would have a field day with this. First of all, they'd be lavishing praise on Justin Trudeau for taking such a bold position. Gun control groups and the media alike would immediately begin the comparison. Why can't we be more like Canada? Look at the common sense steps that Canada is taking. Why can't we do what Canada's taking? And I think that there's a pretty good chance that if Justin Trudeau decides to move forward with a gun ban, not a handgun ban, but a semi-auto ban in the October elections, that again, American politicians, the anti-gun media, and certainly gun control groups will try to use that as a pressure point for U.S. politicians to ban semi-automatic long guns as well. I personally don't think that Justin Trudeau is going to push for a handgun ban in the build up to the elections in Canada. He may very well do so if the Liberals win a majority in Parliament. Once the elections are over, that may be something that he brings back. But, even in Canada, I think outside of places like Toronto, maybe Montreal, you get into the more rural parts of the country, and throw in Vancouver as well, a ban on handguns would be deeply, deeply unpopular. There is already a very stark rural-urban divide in Canada regarding their gun laws. And if Trudeau wants to have any sort of a political future for the Liberal Party outside of big cities, running on a handgun ban is not the way to do it. But something else, again, to keep your eyes on over the next few weeks. It's not just now what's happening in the United States, but what is happening around the world and how that might impact our Second Amendment rights. Also coming up in just a few weeks, a little bit later than the Senate returning, that's September the 9th, October the 1st, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear in conference a motion to dismiss a Second Amendment case, the first Second Amendment case that the court is scheduled to hear since the McDonald case struck down the city of Chicago's handgun ban back in 2010. At issue is a law in New York City regarding the transportation of legally owned handguns. In New York City, you have to get a pistol license in order to legally own a handgun, and it's basically a premises license. You're allowed to possess that pistol on your property. If you're a small business owner, you might be able to have it there at your business, but you're only able to transport that pistol to one of several pre-approved ranges there in the 5 boroughs. That's it. You can't take your pistol to Fort Drum, New York, to go to a shooting competition. If your family has a farm out near Utica, you can't take your legally owned handgun out of New York City so you can do some plinking that weekend. You certainly can't drive over the bridge into New Jersey and go to Gun for Hire Range in Woodland Park if you are a New York City gun owner, not with your firearm. It is a very bizarre law. It's been on the books for decades, at least until a couple of weeks ago. And the city of New York has defended this law at the trial court level, at the appellate court level, and they won, by the way, at the trial court level and the appellate court level. Judges said, yeah, this law is fine. So the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association appealed that Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision up to the Supreme Court, and that's when gun control groups started getting scared. Back in March of this year, there was a gun control advocate named Ladd Everett who wrote a piece for the New York Daily News calling for the city to drop this gun law. Just take the loss. Because if you don't, the Supreme Court is going to weigh in here, and they're going to apply a strict scrutiny standard of review that could not only impact this gun control law in New York City, but it could impact other gun control laws around the country. The court could use this as a vehicle to start talking about not just the right to keep arms, but the right to bear arms. And this would be disastrous for the gun control movement. So just take the L, New York City, and change the law. And they did. A couple weeks ago, the New York Police changed the regulations. New York State Legislature also passed legislation basically saying, New York City, you can't do this. And it wasn't because they realized that they were wrong. And it wasn't because they all of a sudden understood, gee, many Christmas, we're actually impacting people's right to, keep and bear arms here. This was a blatant attempt to avoid Supreme Court review of this law that they had been defending for years. And now you've got 5 Democratic senators, including New York State Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who are demanding that the Supreme Court drop this case when they take it up in conference on October the 1st. They are saying that the court risks politicizing this issue and politicizing the court. And they say that if the court actually hears this case and actually says, yes, the law has been changed, but the law was changed and can be changed right back again once we decide to drop this case. We're going to go ahead and make a ruling here that you can't do these types of things. These 5 senators are actually telling the Supreme Court, you're sick. Your body, the court itself, is unwell, and we would be forced to make it well again by restructuring the court, by court packing. Yeah. Basically threatening the Supreme Court here that if we don't get our way, and if you don't drop this case, something might happen to the makeup of the Supreme Court. Maybe we don't have 9 justices anymore. Maybe we have 19. Maybe we have 14, 17, something. Maybe we got to do whatever we got to do to get an anti-gun majority there. It is, from a legal perspective, it's an awful argument. I can't imagine that it is going to have much sway there on the court. This would seem to be the epitome of legislative interference here. And there's some bad news for those anti-gun senators as well. I got to tell you. Because as it turns out, the Supreme Court has another case that they've been holding over in conference for several months now. They could bring it up and decide they're going to hear it at any time. It's called Rogers versus Grewal, and it's a case out of New Jersey. And it is a case that actually much more explicitly has to do with the right to bear arms, because this is a challenge to New Jersey's concealed carry licensing requirements. New Jersey is one of those states that says you don't have a right to carry we may give you permission to carry, but only if you meet all kinds of subjective criteria. And even if you meet that subjective criteria, we may still deny you anyway. That law is being challenged. And the court has held this over for several months now. It hasn't said, yeah, we're going to take it, or no, we're not going to take it. Court watchers believe that the most likely reason why it's being held over is because any decision that comes down in this New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City case may also have an impact on Rogers versus Grewal. But if the court decided, all right, this New York City law has been changed, case is kind of moot, yeah, they could change the law back as soon as we drop the case, but we're not going to drop it entirely. We're going to send this case back down to the lower courts for further review. So we're going to keep it alive on life support, and it could always come back up here in a couple of years. They could do that with one hand, and with the other hand say, and now we're going to take up this case, Rogers versus Grewal. And then gun control groups have a really interesting decision to make. Because as it turns out, this is not the first time that gun control groups have taken the loss in order to avoid Supreme Court scrutiny of a gun control law. Back in 2012, there was a challenge to the ban on carrying firearms in the state of Illinois. Illinois did not have a concealed carry law. Open carry was not allowed. You could not bear arms in the state of Illinois legally. And that was challenged. And the state of Illinois lost at the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And gun control groups, again, worked with state leaders and Chicago politicians and said, please don't take this case to the Supreme Court. Please just let it go. We know that it means you're going to have a concealed carry law in the state of Illinois, but that's better than the Supreme Court taking a case that deals with a blanket ban on the carrying of firearms and establishing that there is a right to bear arms, not just to keep arms. We can't have that. That would be horrific for our movement. So just go ahead and accept this loss of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's what the state of Illinois did. And now Illinois has a shall issue concealed carry law, has a lot of, I think, onerous training requirements that can make it difficult for people to actually get their license. But last time I checked, and this was about a year ago, well over 20,000 concealed carry license holders just in the city of Chicago alone, and that number seems to be growing by the day. So that was one case. A couple of years ago in Washington, D.C., you had a similar case. Washington, D.C., after the Heller decision, did adopt a process by which one could apply for a concealed carry license. But you were never going to get one because you had to demonstrate good cause, and self-defense wasn't seen as a good enough cause to get a concealed carry license. So that too is challenged in court. And at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Washington, D.C. lost. The judges said this good cause requirement gets in the way. It actually infringes on individuals' right to bear arms. So you can't have it. And again, the district decided, okay, we're not going to take this case up to the Supreme Court. We'll go ahead and we'll lose here. Now, Washington, D.C. Again, it's a burdensome shall issue law. It's not easy to get a concealed carry license because of all the requirements that they put in place, but it is no longer subjective because gun control advocates, again, convince that local government, don't give the Supreme Court a chance to act. So this is the third time now, to the best of my knowledge, there may be more cases, but this is at least the third time that gun control groups have said, change the law, take the laws, do whatever you can to keep a case out of the Supreme Court. It appears that they are desperate to avoid Supreme Court review of any one of these quote unquote common sense gun safety regulations, right? If they're so common sense, Supreme Court should just rubber stamp them. But they're afraid that the Supreme Court won't do that. So Rogers versus Grewal, this Second Amendment carry case out of New Jersey that the court is holding in conference right now and could agree to hear at any time. What happens if the Supreme Court says, all right, this New York City case, it's kind of moot at the moment, so we're going to send it back down to the lower court. Here's Rogers versus Grewal. We're going to put that on the calendar for the spring term. We'll hold oral arguments in February. We'll have our decision out in June of 2020. What would gun control groups' advice to the state of New Jersey be? Would they tell the state of New Jersey, change your law? We can't risk this. You're going to jeopardize our restrictive laws in Massachusetts and in New York State and in Maryland and California and Hawaii and the handful of other states that are still may issue. They might. Could we see a shall issue concealed carry system in New Jersey as a result? Possibly. I think it would be a very, very difficult decision for these gun control advocates to make, because now people are aware of what's going on. And not just gun owners, but justices and judges within the legal system really are aware of how the gun control groups will put these laws on the books, and then at the last possible moment, if need be, they will change these laws in order to avoid judicial scrutiny. So I don't know how much longer they're going to be able to get away with it. They may decide that a case like Rogers versus Grawl would be their hill to make a stand on. And, we're going to defend this New York law this New Jersey law before the U.S. Supreme Court and hope for the best. But I think there would be a lot of late night discussions by a lot of anti-gun activists and a lot of anti-gun politicians about what exactly they should do. And New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, who has said, and so far has been true to his word, that he would sign any gun control bill that got to his desk. I don't know that Phil Murphy wants to be known as the coward who rolled over and let these gun groups put a shall issue concealed carry law in place. His ego and his hubris may actually get in the way of this tactical decision that gun control groups have made in the not too distant past. All right, let's get to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, and of course, a look at the failures to actually enforce existing laws on the books. Chicago, Illinois. Apparently, a gentleman walked into a VA hospital there with a rifle, fired a shot. He's now facing charges, and according to police, no stranger to the law. Yeah, this guy's from Indianapolis, Indiana. Bernard Harvey Jr. is his name. Walked into this VA hospital Monday afternoon. Several people called 911 a short time later, saying that someone was shooting a gun near the southwest corner of the hospital. Officers found the guy. He dropped the rifle, which was reported stolen, as you may see there, just a few weeks ago there in Indiana. Now, as it turns out, according to the Chicago Sun-Times, this guy has quite the lengthy criminal history. He's 40 years old. He's now charged with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Wouldn't be the first time that he could have faced those charges. According to the Chicago Sun-Times, back in 2005, Harvey was convicted of illegal gun possession. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was released on probation in February of 2006. So 4-year prison sentence, did less than a year, it sounds like. In Cook County, he's also got a 2006 conviction for criminal trespass for property. He got 25 days, or at least he was sentenced to 25 days for that. 2005, the same year that he was charged with illegal firearm possession, he was charged with trespassing. 2002, charged with unlawful possession of a firearm and soliciting unlawful business. 1996, he was convicted of defacing a firearm, sentenced to 150 days in prison in that crime. Drug charges in 2000, illegal gun possession in 1998 as well. Right now, he's facing federal charges because, again, this was a federal hospital, a VA hospital. And so this may be the first time that Harvey is going to be facing any serious consequences for any of his gun-related crimes. Being a felon in possession of a firearm, that could land him 10 years behind bars in federal prison. He would have to serve 85% of that sentence before he is eligible for early release, as opposed to what has happened time and time again in Cook County, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, where Mr. Harvey has appeared before a judge on gun-related charges and gotten a don't do that again. Let's get to our armed citizen story from Florida, Middleburg, Florida, where a rideshare driver forced to defend himself as a guy tried to jump into his moving vehicle. This was a Lyft driver who apparently had just dropped off a fare when that gentleman, you see the mugshot there, decided he was going to try to hop inside the car. Apparently, the driver says he saw a dog on the side of the road and had stopped to try to figure out what he could do to help the dog. He was looking for his cell phone so he could try to figure out, okay, where can I take this? Where's a nearby shelter? And this fella, Matthew Caudill, runs up to the passenger side of his car, starts yelling. Driver told sheriff's deputies that he was scared, started to drive off, but Caudill grabbed the partially open window, began running with the car. The driver then accelerated. He grabbed the rack on top of the car and held on as the driver speeding down the road, tried pulling himself onto the roof. At one point, according to the driver, Caudill climbed through the window feet first while sitting there in the window of that moving car. Then Caudill started kicking the driver. And that is when the driver pulled out a firearm, fired a shot. Caudill was struck in the leg, eventually fell from the window onto the highway. Driver called 911 as soon as Caudill hit the ground. Clay County Fire and Rescue took the man to a local hospital. He was arrested after he was medically cleared to leave. The 32-year-old is now been charged with assault and battery during a burglary. He is in jail awaiting a bond hearing. Deputies say that Caudill was, quote, uncooperative. The driver told News 4 in Jacksonville that he was physically okay, a little shaken up by what happened. And, again, I hate to bring this up, but chances are this driver's going to be out of a job with Lyft anyway, because both Lyft and Uber require that their contractors be unarmed while they are working for the rideshare services. So it doesn't matter that you're in your own vehicle. Doesn't matter that you're a concealed carry holder, that you're legally allowed to possess that firearm. As soon as you are on the clock for Uber or Lyft, you are supposed to be unarmed. Now, it should be noted that we've seen several stories over the years of drivers who have decided, I would rather go home safe at the end of the night and possibly risk losing my job than be unarmed and risk being the victim of a violent crime. We've seen several of these rideshare drivers act in self-defense or in defense of others. And again, sadly, when they've done so, they have lost the ability to work with these rideshare companies. Let's get to today's good deed of the day from National Harbor, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., where a couple helped a D.C. police officer after he ended up in a motorcycle crash. He hit a deer. This is about 2 o'clock Sunday morning. Now, listen, I've hit a deer in my car, and it didn't work out well for the deer. It didn't work out well for my car. I cannot imagine what that would be like if you're on a motorcycle and all of a sudden you run into a deer. Andre and Shirley Tyree headed home from National Harbor, Maryland, and they saw the crash happen right in front of them. Andre Tyree says as the deer jumped over the inner loop of the beltway, it came down on the motorcycle. It didn't actually jump over the whole inner loop. It just jumped over the guardrail. Came down on the motorcycle. He said, I immediately pulled over to the fast lane and got out. Tyree and another witness, according to Fox 5 in D.C., dragged the officer to the shoulder of the highway, waited for other officers to arrive. According to authorities, the victim in this case, an off-duty D.C. police officer, luckily taken to the local hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. He was unconscious at the time. So again, thankfully, that quick medical attention may very well have saved a life. Andre Tyree says, I hope he's all right, because I think we have a moral responsibility in the situation like what occurred to do what we can to help one another. He said, I feel really good about doing what I did, especially after I realized it was a police officer. He puts his life on the line every day for us, and I feel good that I was able to do the same for him. So, Andre Tyree, wife Shirley, in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. We thank you for your good deed. And that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. Thank you again for being on the being a part of the program today. We'll do this again tomorrow, but make sure that you are spreading the word and make sure that you're subscribing on YouTube at Town Hall Media. If you like the podcast version of Bearing Arms Cam and Company, you can find that at townhall.com under the podcast section, also on Stitcher, Spotify, and I have been told that very, very soon, perhaps by the time you're watching or listening to this, you'll be able to find the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast there on iTunes as well. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more Bearing Arms Cam and Company.